Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Terrifying Trios. Our subject this month is a popular topic, even among people who say they don't enjoy horror. This time, our theme is crime. Content warning. The following books and films contain detailed descriptions of graphic violence and murder. Images of violence, including death and body horror, poison, blood, death by axe or hatchet, death by hanging, decapitation, discussion of child abuse, discussion of sexual violence, the murder of family members, and depictions of simulated child death. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. Also, spoilers ahead. In particular, if you've never seen our first movie this month, and if you don't know how it ends, go watch it now and then come back. You'll thank me later. Our first film this month is 1995's Seven, starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. Detective William Somerset, Morgan Freeman, is a week from retirement, which can be a harbinger of doom for a fictional cop, but isn't here. His de facto partner, Detective David Mills, is the man who will inherit his office and caseload, and so the two, reluctantly at first, work together to investigate a grisly crime scene. Though no strangers to death and violence, the man they find slumped over his kitchen table is no ordinary murder victim. Somehow, the killer forced the man to eat himself to death. Soon after, a prominent attorney is found dead in his office, with the word greed written in blood at the crime scene. It soon becomes clear that the victim was made to remove a pound of flesh before dying. Somerset tells his boss that this is just the beginning, and he asks to be assigned to something else, not wanting this to be his last case. Mills, eager to prove himself and having butted heads with Somerset, agrees to take over the greed case. While these two murder scenes are certainly disquieting, in their first 2 days of working together, the main thing that strikes Somerset and Mills is the fact that they are very different people. Somerset is studious, doing research at the library to try and understand whatever message the killer means to send, lives a quiet life alone, is willing to ask uncomfortable questions of his fellow cops, and has become disillusioned by both his profession and the violence of the unnamed, but based on New York City in which he spent his life. Mills, on the other hand, is brash, ready to joke even at crime scenes, and quick to anger. Viewers can see that while Mills, a young white man, lives in a world in which his rage is allowed, even celebrated as a sign of toughness or masculinity, Somerset, older, black, has lived a very different life, in which his anger has had to be suppressed for his own safety, ideally channeled into solving crimes. The two both seem eager to finish their week of work together, but because they're sharing an office, Mills at Somerset's former desk, Somerset off to the side, working to wrap up loose ends in his final week as a detective, they share a phone. Tracy, Detective Mills' wife, calls him at work and asks to speak to Somerset. He is surprised, and after the call ends, he informs Mills that he's been invited to dinner. At the Mills apartment, Somerset sees a different side of David. He learns from Tracy that the pair were high school sweethearts and moved from a much more rural community for Mills' new detective job. David happily plays with the couple's dogs and reluctantly shares a laugh with Tracy and William when a passing subway train causes the entire apartment to shake. Somerset, having previously shared photocopies he made at the library with Mills, is pleasantly surprised to find that the younger man is at least trying to understand their killer. No, he isn't going to sit down and study Milton, but he's at least read the Cliff Notes version of several biblically themed works of literature. By this time, having returned to the scene where the first victim ate himself to death, Somerset has found, after moving the refrigerator, the word gluttony. Knowing that gluttony and greed are just 2 of the 7 deadly sins, Somerset and Mills try to find something they might have missed at the first 2 crime scenes, now realizing that they're dealing with a serial killer. Visiting the attorney's wife in the safe house where she's been placed does give the pair a clue. She points out that the painting in her husband's office, a colorful piece of abstract art, is upside down in the crime scene photos. The detectives do find something behind the painting, fingerprints, carefully hidden, and though Somerset and Mills fall asleep while waiting for the computer to find a match, eventually one is found, a man convicted of the sexual assault of children, and there's an address in the police database. A SWAT team breaks into the man's apartment, only to find that this man is not their killer, but rather another victim. Somerset and Mills order the SWAT team out of the room when they find that what everyone thought was a cadaver is actually a man still clinging to life. He was drugged and imprisoned for a year, confined to his bed and kept too weak to move. Mills yells at a nosy photographer who attempts to get a look at the crime scene, and Somerset too is unnerved. This is Sloth, the third victim of what could turn into 7, if they can't find the serial killer in time to stop him. Later at the hospital, the attending physician confirms that death is imminent. The victim was killed with excruciating slowness, and his long, painful death further emphasizes the dangerous nature of the murderer doing all this, since he had to go so far as to pay his victim's rent for 12 months and figure out how to keep the man alive but incapacitated for a full year, to the point of administering antibiotics so his bed sores wouldn't become infected. The week is almost over, and though Somerset still plans to retire, he wants to help find the killer first. On Friday, Tracy asks him to meet her for coffee. Again surprised, he does so, and learns that while she is happy in her marriage, she doesn't know anyone in the city, and is unhappy with her teaching prospects at the locally underfunded schools. She also tells William that she's pregnant, and she hasn't told David yet, because she's uneasy about raising a child in their current environment. Somerset tells her that he was once in a similar situation, and he encouraged his significant other to get an abortion. Now he'll always wonder what might have been, and he tells Tracy not to tell David unless she wants to continue the pregnancy. Next, something of special interest to librarians happens. Somerset contacts someone he knows that he can pay for information. While Mills is unimpressed by the man's shabby appearance, it turns out that he works for the FBI, and is able to get information on people who have checked out books related to the killer's subjects of interest from the library. This movie was released in 1995, and while I can say with confidence that the FBI hasn't been in our records, that's all we're able to do. Libraries don't share or keep patron checkout data, though some people elect to save a record of what they check out, so they don't borrow books they've read before. Following the passage of the Patriot Act, libraries can, for example, put up a sign that says, "The FBI has not been here." Then the sign can be removed if the FBI does request information. Prior to when this movie takes place, during the Cold War, the FBI did have what they called their Library Awareness Program. There's a New York Times article from January 2023 if you're interested in learning more. Again, it's important to distinguish between pre- and post-9/11, because after 9/11, this kind of intelligence gathering was utilized against Muslim Americans, as opposed to people like the killer in 7, who are historically far more likely to commit murder or acts of domestic terrorism, but I digress. The FBI agent gives Somerset and Mills information leading to the address of a man named John Doe. They knock on his door, and then a man at the other end of the hall pauses before shooting at the detectives. Neither man is hit, and a chase ensues. Mills manages to stay close behind John Doe, though he never gets close enough to see the other man's face. Following the man out into the rain, Mills is hit in the head by the killer, who holds a gun to his temple before disappearing. Mills, furious at the killer's escape, kicks in the man's door in spite of Somerset's protests. After all, they don't have a warrant and have no probable cause to search the apartment aside from the information they purchased from an FBI agent, which won't be admissible in court. It turns out they still have some cash left, though. So Mills gives a hungry woman downstairs money in exchange for telling police officers that she told Somerset and Mills to search John Doe's apartment. Inside, the detectives and crime scene investigation team find a veritable mountain of evidence connecting John Doe to the 3 murders, including a photo of Somerset and Mills taken at the Sloth crime scene. It turns out that John Doe was the nosy photographer. However, they don't find any fingerprints. John Doe calls his own apartment phone, and when Mills answers, he congratulates the detective, saying he admires him. Somerset looks through some of the killer's countless notebooks, but there's so much writing, none of it particularly useful, except to paint a picture of John Doe's state of mind. Everywhere he goes, he finds sin. The police are able to confiscate John Doe's cash, in theory making it harder for him to continue hiding and killing, but it's rarely a good idea to corner a serial killer. Limiting the resources he has at his disposal seems to simply accelerate his murderous timeline. By Saturday, the next victim is found, and this time it's lust. A man is held at gunpoint and forced to wear a bladed strap-on, thus murdering a prostitute against his will. Perhaps unsurprisingly, our killer here contributes to the long history of violence against sex workers. Why not murder the man who lusted for her? Instead, the man in question is left shocked and horrified at having killed someone. Next is Pride, on Sunday. A woman is found dead in her home, a model whose face John Doe slashed. However, this wasn't a fatal wound. The victim was left with a phone in one hand and a bottle of pills in the other. Instead of calling for help, she killed herself, the idea being that she would rather die than live without her beauty, which emphasizes how John Doe attacks his victims psychologically. This is an important plot point, obviously, and since we're nearing the end here, seriously, don't listen to the rest of this if you haven't seen this movie. Back at the station, Somerset and Mills hear that Tracy has left a message for David, and then a man with bloody hands walks in and shouts for Detective Mills. It's John Doe, Kevin Spacey, and he has come to surrender. His hands are bloody from cutting the skin of his fingers to remove his fingerprints. After speaking with his lawyer, he wants to make a deal. He will confess to everything if Somerset and Mills will accompany him to where the final 2 victims can be found. If they refuse, he will plead insanity, and thus make it possible that he will not be adequately punished for his numerous and terrible crimes. You can certainly argue that John Doe is in fact insane, but of course, there is a method to his madness. Somerset drives and Mills sits in the passenger seat as John Doe directs them to the remote location where they'll find the Envy and Wrath victims. Both are wearing wires and are followed by a helicopter. One of the few scenes of levity in this film is when the detectives have to shave their chests before taping on their wires, right before the final confrontation with their serial killer. During the drive, John Doe speaks more about his motives. He claims that sin is treated with apathy in everyday life, and that God chose him to commit murder to force people to pay attention. The trio finally reach their destination, a field dotted with power lines, so the helicopter can't get too close, at the side of a dirt road. To Somerset's shock, a van appears and begins driving toward them. He hurries to intercept the van, and John Doe begins to talk to Mills, who has already lashed out at the killer in the car. John Doe insists that he admires Mills, admires, even envies his life, and his beautiful wife. Meanwhile, Somerset stops the van, and the terrified driver tells him that he has a package he was paid to deliver to Mills. Someone in the helicopter mentions the bomb squad, but Somerset, realizing too late that this is a trap, opens the box and finds Tracy's head inside. Note that this is never shown. I was expecting some 1995-style fake gore, but the movie doesn't show you. It knows it doesn't have to, not with this cast, and Morgan Freeman effectively conveys both dawning horror and an urgency to stop what's coming. As Somerset runs back toward Mills and John Doe is still talking, and he has Mills agitated, having said that Tracy begged for her life, and for the life of her future child. Mills famously asks, "What's in the box? What's in the box?" as he brandishes his gun at the handcuffed, shackled killer. And he asks Somerset to tell him that John Doe is lying. But of course, Detective Somerset can't do that. It's written all over his face that the killer is telling the truth. And William speaks to David urgently, telling him that if he kills John Doe, the murderer's plan will succeed. But unsurprisingly, given the circumstances, and this character's angry outburst throughout the film, Mills shoots John Doe until he runs out of bullets, thus becoming Wrath, while John Doe is Envy. Later, Mills is taken away in a police car, though his fate is unclear. He appears blank, as if the man he was that morning died when Tracy did. Somerset tells his boss that, "I'll be around," and then the film ends with this character saying in voiceover, "Ernest Hemingway once wrote, 'The world is a fine place, and worth fighting for.'" I agree with the second part. Obviously, the twist ending of this film is what most people remember. For my part, I knew how the film ended before I watched it, but I was still on the edge of my seat, waiting to see what I knew was coming. I was in college when I first learned about this film. David Fincher's Memento and Fight Club are also fascinating, violent character studies. Now, though, the quote at the end is what has stuck with me. Yes, this film is bleak, but it's also a modern classic that, for my money, is both a thriller and horror film with incredible staying power, almost 2 decades later. I give this film 6 deadly sins out of 7. Our next film is 2012's Sinister, starring Ethan Hawke. Our main character here is Ellison Oswalt, who wrote a true crime bestseller called Kentucky Blood years ago, followed by 2 less popular books. Unable to afford their old home, a huge brick building that looks more like a college dorm than a house, and unable to face a future of editing textbooks to make ends meet, Oswalt moves his family to a smaller home in Pennsylvania. There, Oswalt wants to write about the mystery of the Stevenson family. Both parents and 2 children were hung from a tree branch, and one child, 10-year-old Stephanie, disappeared after the rest of her family was killed. Ellison's wife, Tracy, yikes, I did not notice this connection until I was writing the script, says she doesn't want to know if they've moved into the neighborhood where an infamous crime happened. Ellison promises her that, no, that's not what's going on. And that's the truth, because the Stevensons weren't killed elsewhere in the neighborhood. They were hung from a tree in the Oswalt's new backyard. That's why this new house was so affordable. Being the scene of an unsolved quadruple homicide does tend to lower a property's value. However, Ellison is eager to start work on his new book, and while his son, Trevor, age 12, seems ambivalent about the move, his daughter, Ashley, age 7, misses her old school and their former home. Ellison promises that they'll move back when the book is finished, and Ashley in turn promises, since this has apparently come up in past homes, that she'll only paint on the walls in her room. Ellison gets to work setting up his new office and reviewing the facts of the cold case. He has already been informed by the local sheriff that his officers will not be helping with research for this new book, though one deputy is clearly a fan. The town, understandably, wants to move past the tragedy. But Ellison insists that, since there is a lost child involved, there's a chance for him to do some good and maybe catch a killer, as he did with his first book. Of course, Oswalt also wants to recreate the success of Kentucky Blood and provide for his family, but he tries to tell himself that this isn't about fame or money, but rather justice for the victims. This movie was made in 2012, and I have to say, this examination of true crime was ahead of its time. Yes, many true crime amateur sleuths really do care about solving cases and helping families find closure. Others, as with any enterprise, are absolutely in it for the money above all else. Having Ethan Hawke in this role was excellent casting. To compare him to the protagonists of Seven, I'd say that he's somewhere in between the dichotomy of Detective Somerset and Mills. A flawed man, at times prone to anger and short-sightedness, like not telling his wife that he moved their family into a murder house. He's also someone who does his research and really did solve a crime where the police missed something. These factors quickly establish our protagonist as both sympathetic and infuriating. And then he hears something in the attic. Ellison heads upstairs and finds a scorpion of all things, which he crushes by dropping a box. The box is not something that belongs to his family. It's labeled Home Movies, and inside is a film projector and a collection of Super 8 films. While each one has an innocuous title, pool party, hanging out, etc., in watching the films, Ellison finds that each one is a snuff film, depicting the murder of a different family, and the films span the course of 5 decades. Now, does Ellison call the police and inform them of what he's found? Of course not. Does he tell his wife the truth about their new house? Also no. Does he start drinking heavily? Yes, he absolutely does. While genuinely disturbed by the contents of the films, the one entitled Hanging Out shows the deaths of the 4 Stevensons, Oswalt now believes that he has a huge hit on his hands, and throws himself into writing the book. The Pennsylvania case isn't his only focus now. The unsolved murders of the Miller family happened in St. Louis in 1998, and as in the case of Stephanie Stevenson, one child was discovered to be missing after the rest of his family was murdered. As you can imagine, our hero is sleeping poorly, and it doesn't help that his son Trevor has started having night terrors again. Thinking he hears something moving upstairs, Ellison makes another nighttime trip to the attic and finds a king snake under the lid of the Home Movies box. Drawn inside the lid are stick figures that illustrate details from the unsolved murders, and the name Mr. Boogie. After falling through the ceiling and into the hall below, Ellison is treated by a paramedic for a minor leg wound, and the deputy, who's a big fan of his books, offers to help gather information. Ellison puts the deputy on the trail of the other unsolved murders he's now researching, only later reluctantly admitting that yes, all of these crimes appear to be connected. A strange symbol appears in each film, as does the sinister figure of a man with a pale, mask-like face. The deputy puts Ellison in touch with Professor Jonas, played by an uncredited Vincent D'Onofrio, thanks to Wikipedia for confirming this because I was sure it was him, a man who is familiar with the details of these cases due to his knowledge of the occult, and the fact that police have consulted him in the past about these very crimes. Again, Oswald hasn't told anyone about the films he found, but he has digitized the Super 8 films and taken screenshots that apparently match old crime scene photos. There are 5 unsolved family murder cases in total, dating back to the 1960s. And at each scene, the symbol in question is that of a Babylonian god known as Bughuul. Not much is known about Bughuul, since ancient people believed that even seeing his symbol could cause someone to commit evil, so most visual depictions were destroyed long ago. Bughuul was a child-eating god who would kill entire families and take one child with him to slowly devour. Jonas thinks that this might be the work of a cult, not an individual, but Ellison points out that victims in every case were drugged and unable to struggle, so the series of murders could be the work of a single killer. One night, Trevor is found missing from his bed, and Ellison finds him in the backyard, looking utterly terrified. Tracy gets him back inside, and Ellison goes back out for his baseball bat and phone. I think it's a BlackBerry. The flashlight, like all movie flashlights, is never quite bright enough to really illuminate spaces properly. In the yard, he finds a Rottweiler and returns to the house shaken. Tracy tries to get him to talk about what's really going on, but Ellison is able to convince her that he was just startled by the appearance of the strange dog. By this time, things are starting to come to a head. Ashley paints Stephanie Stevenson on a wall outside her bedroom and tells her mother who the girl is. Tracy and Ellison finally have the argument that I waited the whole movie for. He tries to justify his actions. She angrily points out that what he's done is pretty terrible. Again, don't move your family into a murder house and expect that your wife will eventually, A, find out, and B, just accept it. Ellison insists that this book will be his legacy, and Tracy points out that he shouldn't spoil his present life, his marriage, for this book when Trevor and Ashley are already his legacy. It bears noting that earlier in the film, the couple agreed that if things went badly enough, Tracy would take the kids and go to her sister's house. So, as a viewer, you have to wonder, what did Ellison do before that was even worse than this? Later, Tracy finds Ellison having fallen asleep watching a recording of an interview he did for Kentucky Blood, in which he talks about wanting a family, and she wakes him up to go to bed, clearly somewhat appeased now that Ellison seems to have his priorities in order again. Unfortunately, this is a horror movie, and we've passed the point of no return as far as terrible fates are concerned. After spending a mostly sleepless night searching the house for whatever is making sounds, it turns out to be the 5 missing children, none of which he can see, including Stephanie, who's hiding in Ashley's room while Ashley paints the murders, low enough that her father can't see over what he thinks is her sleeping form. Ellison talks to the deputy. While the author claims to not believe in the supernatural, it's clear that something strange is happening. The deputy says that he absolutely does believe in the supernatural, and thus would never sleep in the Oswalds' home. Finally, on their last night in the house, Ellison follows the sound of the projector up to the attic, and finds the 5 missing children, their skin fetid and rotting, watching one of the Super 8 films. Bughuul appears, first projected on the wall in the film, and then in physical form, jump-scaring Ellison and causing him to fall down the stairs. As with many horror movies, Ellison's wife is not in bed whenever his being alone is most convenient story-wise, and seems to not hear any of this. Maybe she was wearing earplugs while taking a relaxing bath, trying to escape the horrible reality of her new home. The projector and films are tossed out of the attic by some force, and Ellison takes them outside and burns everything. When Tracy discovers him, he tells her that she was right and demands that they take the kids and leave immediately. After being pulled over for speeding, Ellison tells the sheriff that there's not going to be any book, and Ellison and Tracy embrace before the family drives back to their former, huge brick home. While unpacking for the second time in this movie, the deputy tries to call Ellison twice, and he declines the call both times. Ellison gets a video call from Professor Jonas, who has found out a little bit more about Bughuul. It turns out, in addition to his symbol, his coming was foretold long ago by the appearance of a scorpion, snake, and dog. Uh-oh. While carrying a box up to the attic late that night, Ellison is horrified to find the box of films and the projector he burned the night before. All are perfectly intact, but now include extended cut endings. Ellison finally answers the deputy's third call and learns the terrible connection between the murdered families. Each moved from a house where one of the previous unsolved murders happened and were killed soon after the move. It wasn't moving into the Stevensons' house that has doomed the Oswald family. Rather, moving back to their old house has now marked them for death. Ellison thanks the deputy and hangs up. He doesn't try to flee. He seems resigned to whatever will happen next, but above all, he wants to watch the new endings of the home movies. In the extended cut endings, the truth is revealed. Each of the missing children was influenced by Bagul, and they were the ones who drugged and then murdered their families. At the end of each reel, each child looks at the camera, puts a finger to their lips, then disappears. In spite of the fact that he's been drinking coffee, Ellison is starting to feel lightheaded and stumbles toward his desk. Too late, he notices a green liquid at the bottom of his mug and finds a note from his daughter Ashley that reads, "Good night, Daddy." When Ellison wakes up, his mouth is duct taped shut, and he's tied up on the floor of his office. Trevor and Tracy are several feet away, their backs to him. Ashley appears, holding a Super 8 camera and an axe, and says she likes the new endings of the movies better. Then she promises to make her father famous again. Ellison, defeated, closes his eyes. We don't see Ashley axe murder her family, but we do see her paint the walls with their blood, then add a stick figure drawing to those inside the box lid, detailing the deaths of her parents and brother. Meanwhile, the movie she just made plays projected on the wall. The 5 missing children move down the hallway, then tilt their heads, and Ashley does too, revealing Bagul behind her. The other kids quickly disperse, and Bagul picks up Ashley and carries her into the movie. We next see the box back in the attic, now with a new film inside. House painting, 12. Bagul appears for one more jump scare, just his face appearing to look at the audience before the credits begin. Another odd connection between the films 7 and Sinister, their opening and closing credit sequences, respectively, have a similar staccato pace and framing to them. Sinister is a satisfying horror film, though I will say that I would have preferred the Super 8 film scenes be silent. Instead, they're set to music, which does ratchet up the tension, but for me, it drove home the point that this isn't real. The Blair Witch Project, famously, has no music save for a bit of car radio at the very beginning, which does make the scares feel more intense. As in A Quiet Place, you become very focused on sounds, and there's no music to dull the sense of realness. I enjoyed this movie, though I thought it was interesting that the only time Ellison was jump-scared by a Super 8 film was when someone was killed with a lawnmower. Yes, that was visually horrible, but the idea here is that these are all snuff films. Watching anyone die, slowly or suddenly, has a strong effect. He does spend a lot of the movie drinking and or smoking to cope. While true crime is doubtless fascinating, and solo investigators really can help suffering people find closure, this story highlights the way that tragedy can also become a business. The retelling of terrible stories, a career that claims an interest in the capital T truth, whether that's the primary motivation or not. Of course, thanks to the Babylonian god Bagul, Ellison Oswalt's career as a writer comes to a sudden and grisly end. I give this film 3 home movies out of 5. While true crime as a genre is something that I have less interest in than I used to, I have to admit a fondness for old cases where everyone involved is dead, and maybe that's why my fascination feels less ghoulish. Case in point, this month's book is The Borden Murders, Lizzie Borden and the Trial of the Century by Sara Miller. In case you're not familiar with the story of Lizzie Borden, here are the basic facts. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Mr. Andrew Borden and Mrs. Abby Borden were found dead in their home, having both been repeatedly struck by a hatchet. Lizzie Borden, Andrew's daughter, age 32, and Abby's stepdaughter, was the only person home at the time, save for the family's maid, who was called Maggie. Maggie was the second person to see Mr. Borden dead, after Lizzie found her father's body on the sofa. The whole family had recently been ill with food poisoning, and Maggie was trying to get some rest before making lunch when Lizzie shouted for help. It soon became clear that there was just one prime suspect, Lizzie Borden. After all, her story was inconsistent, though a doctor may have given her a substance with morphine in it before she spoke to the police on at least one occasion, and others accused, including Lizzie's uncle, had an alibi at the time of the murders. Lizzie had no alibi. She claimed to have been out in the barn looking for gear to take fishing, and then she came back inside and found her father's body. Maggie and a neighbor later found Mrs. Borden upstairs. She had apparently been killed while cleaning the guest room. While the head of the hatchet that killed the Bordens was never found, Lizzie was arrested for the double murder later in August. The question soon became, could a woman, active in her church and with no violent history, commit such a brutal double murder? While Emma, Lizzie's older sister, believed that Lizzie was innocent, it bears noting that her fate may have come down to the fact that, following the deaths of Andrew and Abby, the siblings were rich women and were able to hire their state's former governor as Lizzie's defense attorney. This book does an excellent job of looking at all the evidence and testimony available concerning this crime. I went into this book convinced that Lizzie Borden was guilty, but after reading this account of the investigation and trial, I have to say that I have reasonable doubt that she did it. Yes, she had the motive and opportunity, but it bears noting that the police didn't like her and focused on Lizzie in the absence of other suspects. This suggests that, as with other unsolved axe murders, including the one in Villisca, Iowa in 1912, the fact that forensic science was in its infancy made it hard to solve crimes, and harder still to catch killers when physical evidence was either ignored or contaminated. Also, if you'd like to read more about famous unsolved murders, including axe murders, in the United States, might I recommend American Murder Houses, a coast-to-coast tour of the most notorious houses of homicide by Steve Lehto, or The Man from the Train, the solving of a century-old serial killer mystery by Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James. At Lizzie's trial, her defense team made much of the fact that on the day of the murders, no blood was seen or found on Lizzie's clothes. She did burn a dress later, which struck many as suspicious, but the fact remains that in 1892, a well-off woman like Lizzie couldn't change clothes without help. Was Maggie the maid her accomplice? Or did she somehow hack two people to death without getting a drop of blood on herself? 90s kids may remember the phrase, "If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit," from the O.J. Simpson trial. And as in that case, Lizzie Borden was ultimately acquitted, though for the rest of her life, and decades after her death, many people believe that she got away with murder. Crime is fascinating for much the same reason that horror is. Humans tell stories and have for as long as we've existed. Many of these are cautionary tales, and with true crime you get everything from a sense of catharsis, like when the Golden State Killer was finally caught, and the illusion of safety. Horror and true crime both offer a safe way to experience intense emotions, to help people face their fears in a controlled environment, and maybe even a sense that by understanding terrible violence we gain knowledge that helps us move through the world more safely. Of course, knowing what not to do in a story is very different from knowing how to move wisely through the world, and wisdom alone is no guarantee of safety. But sometimes that illusion is all we have, and since most people live their whole lives without experiencing violent crime, most of us, for example, will never be murdered by a serial killer, maybe safety is more than an illusion. Maybe it's something society can aspire to. And statistically speaking, having better safety nets and resources for struggling people does indeed reduce crime. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another terrifying trio.